Hi everyone, I'm Taron and this is Zebralette 3, and today we will have a look at additive synthesis and particularly the spectral distortion using guides. But I'd also like to throw in the spectral decay because number one, it shows another very different use of the guides, like how the guides work. But also it shows really the beautiful power of Zebralette 3 in that context. It's just absolutely amazing. Okay, and for that I'm going to init my patch and we're gonna raise the velocity so that way when I play it will not be all too shocking. And I think I'm also gonna turn off my limiter because then it will be purely Zebralette without anything else. And also we can just have a look at over here the spectrum analyzer then. And the scope, but the scope won't be that interesting this time around. While we are still in the wavetable renderer, the scope will still show a very neat waveform. But the moment we switch to additive, it will be put on the partials, and that might sound similar, but it will certainly look very different in the scope. You can still somewhat guess that there might be a saw wave, but it isn't. And the other thing to mention is right now the source is still curved geometry. That means it will look at these curves here as sample cycles. So that way you would have your wavetable over here. But what we really want to do when we work additively is work with a curve spectrum. And at that point, this will actually represent a partials profile. In other words, it shows you the energy across the partials. With that grid, that is for the waveforms rather, it's evenly spaced to understand time. That is important when you design samples. But if you go into the spectrum, this will not give you any useful information. To do that, we're going to go straight into Edit, and we're going to switch the grid, and I already had, from this evenly spaced, time-based grid to a harmonic series-based partials grid. So now we can see the partials. Partial 1, the fundamental, partial 2, 3, 4, and so forth. When you zoom in, you can see even the number of the smaller partials higher up. There's that. And in the background, we can see a plot of the resulting sample, which would be like the ideal shape. Obviously, it doesn't have that when we go through the additive process. But what we can do is we can switch that plot to rather show us our partials profile, how it actually translates. And you can kind of also then see that when we look at the spectrum analyzer. See that shape? And right here you can see it too. And likewise, if I go and raise some other partials, you can sort of see that shape here. And what it looks like on the spectrum analyzer. I absolutely recommend using a spectrum analyzer because it's a great orientation for what you actually are doing to the sound with the partials. To simplify everything, I'm going to turn all the partials to 0. Let's take it off, okay. And we're going to just have energy on the first fundamental, and that then is just a sine wave. If I were to switch the plot domain back to time, you can see it's just a sine wave. Likewise, if I then bring in the second partial, you can see how the waveform deforms, and it adds another, the first overtone, so to say, in the form of the second partial. And here you can see both of these partials. I switch back to frequency and you can see, there they are. Let's bring in a third one too. And you see wherever this curve crosses over a partial, it gives us energy on that partial. In between there, nothing happens, so that doesn't matter. It's where they cross over that matters. Now we have 3 partials. And let's use this opportunity to just jump straight into the spectral distortion. And that is this cute little dial over here. And by default, it has a modifier that is called expansion. And expansion refers to the tuning of the partials and how they will get then expanded when I raise that dial. And that means we are not stuck with a harmonic series as we are with most additive synthesizers. In fact, we can alter the pitch per partial. Now this expansion will happen to all partials and it will then look like this. And likewise, there's also a compression, which does the opposite, and it compresses them down all the way to the fundamental as we raise the spectral distortion. There are various other modifier modes, but those I leave to you to explore. They are basically preset clusters on how the spectral distortion will change the pitch of the partials. But what I find most fascinating is the curve modifier, because that allows you to use a guide in order to determine how any particular partial will change in tune as you raise the spectral distortion. And so we're going to turn on our curve right away, and it shows guides as our medium to make that happen. Let's go and edit a guide. For that we go here and click on our first little guide over here, and you see it's blue. And what happens right now, the default guide is just a nice diagonal so we can see it exists. And when I were to raise the spectral distortion, something rather arbitrary happens. And the reason for why that is because in case of spectral distortion, the guide has a 0 position down the center. So that means if we have a flat line like that right down the center, we will get absolutely no deviation for the tuning of the partials. See, nothing is happening. But now if I go ahead and I add point over there for partial number 3, and I'm going to bring it back down to 0 around that partial, that means only partial number 3 will get distorted. And upwards is expansion and downwards is compression. There is a very, very simple formula for that. And I just figured it out this morning. And the funny little crystal shroom sound I started this off with was just while I was experimenting to figure out that formula, which is so easy, but you know, if you don't know, it's confusing. And the way expansion and contraction work, and I'm going to keep this brief, is it offsets the tune based on the partials frequency plus the partials frequency minus the fundamental times the spectral distortion. The fundamental is always one step back in the partial series. So that means if I take partial number 3 and I expand it, for example, it is 3 plus 3 minus 1 times the spectral distortion. So that means if this one is distorted by 1, so completely, it ends up on partial number 5. Let's prove this real quick, just so we have that in the can. Partial number 5. Oh, this one. Yeah, partial number 5, you see? And since we only transform partial number 3, partial number 5 will stand where it is, and only 3 will go to 5. right? And likewise, it's actually the exact same formula, except it goes minus if you go to compression. Because this down here is -1, and this up here is +1. Haha! Okay. If you are still with me, this is very interesting to know, because that way, for once, you understand that the higher you go in the partials, the larger the deviation is from the original partial, right? And that means let's make a, well, let's just make a sound that has all the partials. Raw, not that harsh. Okay. If I were to modify, whoop, let's take this off, the upper partials with the spectral distance, each partial higher up will have will be influenced in a stronger way by that deviation. And that is interesting to understand for various reasons. First of all, if you want to create a little bit of disorder, you only need to have a very small deviation. You can either do that by cranking your guide all the way down and just having a little bit of spectral distortion, but that's boring. Because you might want to do some wilder stuff. And you do that rather in the guides, I think, than with the parameter itself. So let's put that all the way up. And you can hear, without any distortion, it is a very stale sound. Right? But once the distortion is there, you get this slight elevation, that slight disturbance. And that slight disturbance adds so much color to your instrument already. And the other thing too is normally most instruments don't really have a perfect, they're not perfectly on the harmonic series. And so there are always these slight differences. If I do like a little difference, for example, for the first fundamental partials, and a bit of a larger, like just slightly different on the upper ones, you get a lot of complexity right away. It's almost as if you had unisono turned on. Somebody tell me that this is not amazing. And you can do this very, very carefully per partial if you want to. And, do your whatever offsets how you like them. A lot of crazy things you can do with that. But alone for that reason, it's just absolutely gorgeous. All right, so that's part one. Part two is you can morph between different guides. So for example, I can have guide 1 be whatever this is. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just copy this one, copy curve, then go onto the second guide, make sure that nothing is selected, and say paste curve. And now the second guide has the exact same curve as the first guide. And now I can change the spec morph from 0 to 50. This one blends between the guides. 50 is guide 2, 100 is guide 3. So we're going to go on 50. So now the second guide is in effect. And I'm going to do something rather different, like that. So you can, I suppose you can hear the difference. So the second guide creates a lot more havoc. Wonder if I should make it even more extreme. Oh. And the first guide is rather harmless. And now what we can do is we can modulate that. So we put our spec morph to 0, and let's just use MSEC and target the spec morph, and we move this by 50. So set it to 50, and then our MSEC, we can edit that right here. Just switch to MSEC editor over here. We'll move our morph parameter. And for that, we're just going to make a simple kind of like a decay. Oh, barbaric. But yeah, what a ruckus this creates right away. A single oscillator, which would be a lie, because in reality, since it's a harmonic series, we have 256 oscillators. And finally, this allows us to notice it. Yep, I believe it. All right, so the other thing too is, instead of using guides, we now used guide 1 and 2. You may also use curve set. That was something that puzzled me in the beginning. What does this even mean? This refers to the curves that you normally have as your wavetable. And so you can bastardize some of them if you want to as your guides. So instead of using these guides, let's just copy, let's copy it again. Copy this curve, and we make a new curve here at 80. There. And let's go into the curve editor, and we paste this one. Now, that same guide as guide 1 is now on our wave on place 80, right? And let's take the second guide and copy that one to our last wave here. Paste. And there we go. And now I can use the curve set and bring the spec morph up to 80, which is where our first guide would have been. 80, and we say this is going to go just 20 higher to 100. And now we have the exact same sound, except we're using the curve set. Ooh, on there. Another interesting thing about this is now you can use a lot more curves, so to say, to morph between if you wanted that. And who knows, because there's, there's no limit to what you can think up. Many, many ideas. Sure, that's guide and curve sets. Let's do this. Let's leave it on the curve set right now. And we're going to the guides, and we're just going to use them for something completely different. Ta-da-dee-da-da-dee-da. Oh, clickety. So, all right. And what we're going to do is we are going to add our spectral decay. We do that in the oscillator FX, and we go to spectral decay. And by default, it also says guides. And the morph is on 0, means it uses the first guide. And when we crank up the depth, what the spectral decay will do is it will decay the partials based on what the curve says. In other words, the partials that are high will decay very fast, and the fundamental and the partials that go towards the fundamental rather slow, and that will create this. And if this is too fast for you, do not go to depth and change that, because this will just leave out the partials, like 50% or whatever, it doesn't matter. So don't do it like that. Rather keep the depth on 100, and now change your guide to say, oh, I'm just gonna let the highest partials decay that much faster. See, and they all go down to 0. But it gets wilder, Because what we can do is, let's make this decay a bit faster. You can tell certain partials to decay slower than others. And let's say we have the fundamental decay first, and up to the third partial, they decay even faster. Fourth, fifth, but the eighth partial stays up the longest. That is like 1, 2, 3 octaves higher. That partial will stay on the longest, and so we have almost like a metallic effect. And because this is on 1, it'll never decay and follows exactly your amplitude envelope. So you can take this down a bit, and then it will also decay, but just slower. Isn't that amazing? I think it's amazing. And so yeah, you can design your decay profile any way you like. Let's say you just want the second octave to stay on longer, and you want the partial to go away really, really quickly. Isn't that amazing? So you can see the guides here have a very different kind of response, like the number. In this case, it goes from 1 to 0 as a multiplier. So there's that. 0 to 1. And for our spectral distance, -1 to +1. So those are two distinct ways of using the guides for two of my most favorite features in Zebralette, or Zebralette. I like saying Zebralette. Anyhow, I hope that gave you some inspiration and it wasn't too dreadful boring with all the technicals. Sometimes this can get a little dicey, but it's great when you understand this. Trust me, this gives you a much greater sense of control, and at least it's for me like that. And I still do things, naturally I do things by ear, but it's just nice to have a good orientation, also an inspirational component, if you sort of understand, especially something that is so exciting like this stuff. All right, bye for now.